So good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank Curtis, Greg, and for inviting me here tonight. I'd also like to thank all of the sponsors for tonight's talk, the Koch brothers, ExxonMobil, the Knights Templar, and other groups too numerous and nefarious to mention. I'm glad you're all here because the social justice movement is the most dangerous threat to Western civilization since the invention of the metric system. It is a vast communist conspiracy which I aim to expose tonight with the help of PowerPoint, 5 cans of Red Bull, and this ingeniously designed mind ray reflector here. Okay? So, you ready? So, now, I hope that's not what you're expecting tonight. If so, you're in for a disappointment. You may have to save your bricks and air horns for the next speaker, which is also me. Actually, hold on to this for 2 weeks, for the 2 weeks from now speaker, because I'm here to represent Ratio Christi, to talk to them. They sponsored me. They didn't pay me anything. I'm hoping Curtis might take me out for a milkshake afterwards, Chick-fil-A. Crossing my fingers. So I'm here tonight to talk to you about the social justice movement. But why? After all, my PhD is in theoretical chemistry. That has nothing to do with social justice. So why am I interested in this subject, and why should you be interested in this subject too? Well, here's my outline. Let's begin with that question. Why should we care? Once I've made the case that the social justice movement is a culturally and ideologically important phenomenon, we'll next ask, well, what is social justice? Unfathomably, people will argue endlessly about whether social justice is a good idea without ever defining what that term means. You have to do that. Third, I'm going to explain the ideology of the social justice movement. This is what's known as critical theory. It's a set of ideas or the worldview that all argue forms the foundation for this movement, or at least large parts of it. And finally, I'll outline the strengths and the weaknesses of this ideology. Just to clarify, I'm not planning on offering any critique at all of social justice or of critical theory for the first 4 sections of this talk. In the 4th section, I'll even point out some of the strengths of critical theory that I think we should all take very seriously. I'm going to try to remain as neutral as I can be when I describe these ideas. So if you are expecting me to stand up here screaming at you like Alex Jones for an hour, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I can scream at you afterwards, if you'd like. And I'm also not critiquing every organization that claims the mantle of social justice. That would be impossible and undesirable. Many organizations and people who are committed to social justice are doing good work. Instead, I'm critiquing the ideology that informs large segments of this movement. Let's begin with this question. Why should we study the social justice movement? Well, first, and in my opinion, the least interesting reason to study this movement is its relevance to modern politics. A lot of political figures claim to be committed to social justice. For example, here's a picture of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, recently won a Democratic primary in New York, and she talks a lot about social justice, as do many other candidates on the left side of the political aisle. On the right side, not so much. Because of its visibility in politics, if you want to be an informed voter, you need to figure out what social justice is and how you feel about it. But what if you're like me? I'm not very political. I barely vote. I just do it for the sticker. So maybe you feel the same way. Why should you bother worrying about social justice? Well, reason number 2. It's cultural relevance. Social justice isn't just a political issue. It's a cultural issue. This is a photo from the 2017 Women's March, which puts social justice front and center. Even if you're completely apolitical, you can't walk down the street or turn on the television without hearing about social justice. It's at the heart of the NFL protests. It gets mentioned at the Oscars, award shows. When you walk to class, you may be accosted by protesters arguing about social justice. So unless you want to be totally lost in our culture, which might not be a bad idea for your mental health, frankly, but if you don't want to be lost, it's worth knowing about social justice. Third, social justice has ideological relevance. So I'm going to show you in a few minutes, there's an entire set of ideas that form the foundation for the secular social justice movement. Once you understand these ideas, the movement makes a lot more sense. Here's a poster for a degree program in social justice studies from the City College of San Francisco. Notice the departments listed on this poster: ethnic studies, women's studies, Latin American studies, labor studies, trans studies. At first glance, it's a bit strange that all these different disciplines are grouped together under the same umbrella of social justice, right? After all, what does sexuality have to do with Latin America or economics? Imagine a poster advertising a degree in reality studies that included subjects like geophysics and astronomy alongside French literature and jazz. You'd be very confused. If an alien anthropologist said, "I don't get humans. What's the connection here?" You'd probably say, "Yeah, I don't get this either." Is there some unifying ideology that links these disciplines and ideas? Yes. Not for reality studies, but for social justice studies. I'm going to argue tonight that critical theory is the ideology that connects all these topics and explains how they can be united under a single banner called social justice. That connection is incredibly helpful because I think you'll see why so many people are concerned with social justice and why they take precisely the same positions on so many different issues in politics and in culture. That happened to me. I couldn't quite understand why so many people believed exactly what they did until I began to study critical theory, and then everything suddenly clicked and made much more sense. Okay. And finally, I think the issue of social justice has religious relevance. I'll say a little bit more at the end of this talk, but if you want to hear a lot more, next week I'll be giving a talk about social justice and Christianity in particular. So please come back if you want to hear more about this last point. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that studying social justice is worthwhile if you want to understand the basic ideologies which people hold. It's a lens through which they view reality, or what's called their worldview. That worldview will then shape culture, and culture in turn shapes politics. So let's turn to the question, what is social justice? If you want to have an intelligent conversation about this topic, or if you want to think intelligent thoughts, which is always a good idea, you have to define your terms clearly. And this discussion is no exception. So what does social justice mean? The answer is complicated because there are many different ways to define social justice. Let me list just 3 ways, 2 concrete and 1 kind of more abstract and nebulous. Here first, let's start with a concrete definition for social justice. The term social justice was coined by a Catholic priest in the 19th century. He used this term to encapsulate the Catholic Church's teaching about what a just, fair, and righteous society looks like, a society which promotes human flourishing. Even today, there is an entire section shown here on the slide. There it goes. Shown here in the Catholic Catechism on social justice. Additionally, when some evangelical Christians talk about social justice, they're also thinking about applying biblical principles of justice to society. However, my guess is that when you mention the term social justice, most people don't immediately think of Catholicism or the Bible. Some might, but most don't. When you hear the phrase social justice on a college campus like this one, maybe 5-10% of people are using it this way. Second, here's a more common definition, but it's very imprecise. The phrase social justice can be used as a catchphrase, a synonym for a very good thing that everyone wants. So if your roommate says that he is into social justice, and you say, "Oh, social justice, what's social justice?" It's possible that he'll respond, it's justice, but social justice. It's one of those things that everybody loves, like ice cream and puppies and Taylor Swift music. And if you don't love it, you're a monster. Okay, if we're a little more careful, we could say something like this. Social justice is the application of justice to laws and social institutions. Okay, but wait a minute. Then you have to answer questions like, what is justice? What is a just law? How does the concept of justice apply to social institutions? Now, these are very important questions that don't have agreed upon answers. People could accept that definition of social justice being a just society and still differ radically over what it entails because they have totally different conceptions of justice. So this second definition is very common, but very, very imprecise, not very helpful at all. But there is a third definition, and that's the definition I want to focus on tonight. Here's a book called Readings for Diversity and Social Justice. It's an anthology of essays, articles, and book chapters on a whole variety of topics, all of which are categorized under the heading of social justice. Unsurprisingly, the phrase social justice was mentioned a lot. But I kind of assumed when I read it the first time that it was used according to definition number 2. It was just a kind of vague buzzword, didn't mean a lot. I came across the first explicit definition of the phrase social justice on page 483. I kid you not. Page 480. There's the definition. The definition provided was, social justice is the elimination of all forms of social oppression. I had an epiphany. Everything made sense. The authors in this book, throughout the book, had not been using the term social justice as some nebulous, meaningless catchphrase. It meant something very concrete and precise. To them, social justice meant liberation from all forms of social oppression. They've been using this phrase perfectly consistently and concretely throughout the book. And they've been enumerating many different forms of oppression. Sexism, racism, classism, homophobia, transphobia, colorism, ageism. It's right there on the cover of the book, if I bothered to check. So the authors are unanimous that all of these were forms of oppression, all these isms, and that social justice is just the elimination of all these various oppressions. That's how they were defining social justice. So we have 3 potential definitions for social justice. Number 1, we have Catholic social teaching or religious social teaching. Number 2, we have an imprecise, positive buzzword. And number 3, we have liberation from oppression. Tonight, I want to focus on just this third definition. Why? Because I think that when people actually talk about social justice, especially on a campus like this one, they're really talking about this third definition. I'm not denying it's possible to use the phrase in other ways, but I think this is what you're going to hear when you take classes at NC State, you talk to people. They're talking about liberation from oppression. So now that we've defined social justice, are we done? No. The term social justice, at least according to this third definition, refers to the elimination of all forms of social oppression. But what is oppression? How do we define that? And here we need to turn to a set of ideas called critical theory. I'm going to argue that social justice, in this sense, is rooted in an ideology known as critical theory. So that when you hear people talk about social justice, they're often assuming a framework of critical theory. That brings us to our third section. What is critical theory? Again, this is the ideology at the foundation of a lot of social justice. It's a set of beliefs or ideas that is foundational to many different disciplines in the humanities. Things like gender studies, cultural studies, critical race theory, critical pedagogy, feminism, anthropology, literary criticism. If you've taken a class in the gender studies department, you've probably heard a lot of critical theory. But keep in mind that the tenets of critical theory are usually implicitly assumed and accepted, not explicitly stated. In other words, you're not going to walk into class one day and hear a lecture on critical theory. Instead, the assumptions of critical theory are going to suffuse the material you learn. In the same way, if you take a class on genetics, your professor is not going to start with his first lecture by introducing the basic laws of physics or chemistry. These laws are assumed in every class you take, but they will rarely be mentioned explicitly. So if most people don't attach a list of the 10 commandments of critical theory to their syllabus, then how exactly do we know what it is? Well, that's a tough question. Like any broad philosophical school of thought, it can be hard to define. So I think the best approach is to identify the set of basic principles shared by most modern critical theorists. Rather than focusing on the origin of these ideas, we can see what they say themselves today. So what are the big ideas of critical theory? I picked out 7 of them, 4 major premises and 3 minor ones. The first 4 are nearly universally accepted, while the final 3 are popular but not quite as widespread. So in this next section, I'll explain each belief and illustrate it with a quote or 2, but then I want to provide an example of how you see these ideas at work in popular culture. I'm hoping that after we work through a few of these ideas, you begin to see how pervasive they really are, You see them everywhere, in movies and music, on social media, and in lecture halls across the country. So number one, critical theory insists that our individual identity, who we are as individuals, is inseparable from our group identity. In particular, our individual identity depends on whether we are part of a dominant oppressor group or a subordinate oppressed group with respect to some identity marker. In other words, all categories of identity, like race, class, gender, physical ability, age, and so forth, are divided into categories of oppressed and oppressor, subordinate and dominant, victim and victimizer. Your identity is inseparable from your membership in these various groups. For example, Peggy McIntosh here, who coined the phrase white privilege in a seminal 1988 paper, writes, "My schooling gave me no training in seeing myself as an oppressor." In other words, she was an oppressor, but she didn't know it. I was taught wrongly to see myself as an individual whose moral state depended on her individual moral will. According to critical theory, it's not possible for you to say, okay, I understand that there are racist white people out there who create racist laws. I'm not denying that. That's not me. I should be treated as an individual, not as a member of a group. Well, critical theorists deny that you can understand your own identity apart from your membership in a dominant group. Now, how does this claim emerge in practice? This is fascinating. So I went on Twitter a few weeks ago, and I entered the phrases old white male and entitled white male into the search box. I do not recommend doing that. Here are some of the results, all from people with thousands or hundreds of thousands of followers. And note the number of retweets and likes. These are people tapping into a major stream of thinking in our culture. Look at the Michael Evanity's tweet here. These old white men like Ted Cruz will say anything. He goes on to talk about the Kavanaugh hearings. And Christine Fair, who's a professor at Georgetown, she fantasized about the deaths of old white men, entitled white men. Now, two observations to make here. Number one, notice how individual men, like Ted Cruz or other senators, are treated as a single monolithic demographic group. The tweet doesn't complain about, oh, Ted Cruz will say anything. Instead, they complain that old white men like Ted Cruz will say anything. His individual identity is inextricably linked to his group identity. Second, imagine substituting white men with any other demographic group. Could you imagine how much greater the outrage would be if you fantasized openly about the deaths of old Asian women or young Hispanics? What's the difference? The difference arises from power dynamics. These other demographic groups are not dominant oppressor groups. Therefore, it is not socially acceptable in most places to mock or deride them as a group. On the other hand, it is not as problematic, according to critical theory, to mock or deride old white men because they are an oppressor group. Okay, that's how we see this idea in practice. Number two, oppressor groups subjugate oppressed groups through the exercise of hegemonic power. What's hegemonic power? Hegemonic power is the ability to impose your values or your group's values, expectations, and norms on the rest of culture. In this way, hegemonic power is distinguished from like money or influence or mere numbers. So here are Sensor and D'Angelo. They say this: in any relationship between groups that define one another, men and women, able-bodied, disabled, young and old, the dominant group is the group that is valued more highly. Dominant groups set the norms by which the minoritized group is judged. Dominant groups have a greater access to the resources of society and benefit from the existence of the inequality. So given this premise, we can see why men, or whites, or heterosexuals, or the rich are classified as oppressors. When critical theorists make this claim, they are not necessarily saying that all white men or all heterosexuals engage in a prolonged or cruel, unjust treatment or control. That would be the dictionary definition of oppression. It's not what they're using. Instead, they're saying that these groups as groups have imposed their values on society. That's why they can say that a man is an oppressor even if he has never treated a woman cruelly or unkindly in his entire life. It also explains why power has nothing to do with numerical size. For example, only 31% of the U.S. population is white and male. An even smaller fraction of this group has graduate degrees, about 12% of this group, so maybe like 4% of white men are highly educated. Then an even smaller fraction of that group is actually rich. So the very wealthy, educated white males are a tiny, tiny, tiny minority. Yet they are categorized as the canonical oppressor group, right? So it doesn't matter. The size does not matter. It's the hegemonic power your group has. Number 3, different oppressed groups find solidarity in the experience of oppression. David Mura, a Japanese-American activist, writes, I, as a Japanese-American, feel a kinship to both blacks and Native Americans that I do not feel with white Americans. It comes from our shared experience as victims of injustice. Similarly, Sherry Moraga writes, I realized that I could be beaten on the street for being a lesbian. If my sister is being beaten because she's black, it's pretty much the same principle. Here we see that people with very different identity markers are united by their shared experience of oppression. It doesn't matter whether you experience oppression because of your race, and I experience oppression because of my sexuality. We're both oppressed, and that can draw us together. Here's an example of how this solidarity occurs in practice. This is photos from your website, sustainability@ncsu.edu. I pulled this photo, so this is great because the sign in the foreground is a great illustration of this principle. It says Black Lives Matter, Trans Lives Matter, Muslim Lives Matter. If you think about that slogan for a second, those slogans, it's actually a surprising combination. Those are 3 separate issues, right? I mean, race, gender, and religion. What do they have in common? Oppression. According to critical theory, blacks, transgendered people, and Muslims are all oppressed groups. That's why we see so much confluence between these activist groups and the causes they support. There might even be tension between the self-interest of groups in these coalitions. What's good for blacks or Muslims might not be good for Hispanics. Who knows? But they can still find solidarity through their shared experience of oppression. Premise 4, which might be the most important one of all. Our fundamental moral duty is freeing groups from oppression. Here's feminist Susanna Farr. She writes, these political times call for renewed dialogue about and commitment to the politics of liberation. Liberation requires a struggle against discrimination based on race, class, gender, sexual identity, ableism, and age. She's writing that in 1996, in the middle of the Clinton presidency. Unsurprisingly, these sentiments were amplified just a little by Trump's election. So what are the implications of this commitment? Now notice that liberating groups from oppression is our fundamental moral duty. It is very rare for proponents of critical theory to affirm or promote moral values and duties like honesty, kindness, patience, compassion, chastity, marital fidelity, or self-control. Even when they talk about economics, the duty of personal charity, personal generosity, personal giving is rarely discussed. Instead, the discourse centers on dismantling unjust structures. This focus on liberation of groups can have serious implications. Here's one. Here's an extreme example. This is Antifa. They're obviously an extreme group, but last year a member of Antifa hit a Trump supporter in the head with a bike lock. The guy wasn't doing anything. He was just sitting there talking. He hit him in the head with a bike lock. Amazingly, the man who committed the assault taught ethics at a local university. So here, even moral imperatives like, you shouldn't hit people with bike locks, even that moral imperative is considered to be less important than abstract principles like resisting oppression. Now, obviously, Antifa is an extreme example, but it shows how this principle works itself out in practice. Next, let's look at 3 final propositions, which are not quite as central to critical theory, but are still very important. Number 5. Lived experience is more important than objective evidence in understanding oppression. Here are Anderson and Collins. The idea that objectivity is best reached only through rational thought is a specifically Western and masculine way of thinking, one that we will challenge throughout this book. Now, what do they propose to take the place of rational thought? Story, narrative, personal testimony, lived experience. So one common example of this way of reasoning is in the debate over abortion. It's common for men who attempt to discuss abortion to be told the slogan, no uterus, no opinion. I'm not criticizing them, saying they hear this. Now why? Why use that slogan? Well, one reason is that a man, as an oppressor, cannot understand the lived experience of women who are oppressed. So that's why you can throw out the slogan, because they are part of the wrong group. They don't have purchase on your own experience as a woman. Number 6, oppressor groups hide their oppression under the guise of objectivity. The claim being made here is that there are no completely neutral observers who present us with totally objective facts, quote-unquote facts. Instead, oppressor groups claim that their observations are neutral and objective, but this claim is a strategy to cloak their will to dominate. So one might think that this premise is limited to controversial facts, like about politics or psychology, but some critical theorists are willing to take this claim to an extreme conclusion. For example, here's an abstract of a recent paper on feminist glaciology, the study of glaciers. And it argues that science is gender, and that, quote, feminist glaciology framework generates robust analysis of gender, power, and epistemologies in dynamic social ecological systems, thereby leading to a more just and equitable science and human ice interactions. I know that sounds like a hoax, but it truly seems to be legitimate. This is a peer-reviewed paper written by a very sincere author. And it's fully consistent with the view that knowledge, human knowledge, is really contingent on our identity, right? We claim to be objective scientists, but really we're just, our ideas, our facts are colored by our identity and our agendas. Number 7. Individuals at the intersection of different oppressed groups experience oppression in a unique way. Here's a quote from the authors of an influential book on critical race theory. Imagine a black woman who may be a single working mother. She experiences, potentially, not only multiple forms of oppression, but ones unique to her and to others like her. Although the phrase intersectionality is a bit of a trigger word for conservatives, I take it to be one of the least controversial aspects of critical theory. If we define it carefully, it just says that when it comes to identity, there are interaction effects. If you're a sociologist, or if you're an engineer or mathematician, if you picture the oppression matrix, there are off-diagonal elements of the oppression matrix. All it's saying is that your different identities can interact in unusual ways. That's all it's saying. This should be totally uncontroversial. The applications of intersectionality are controversial, but the concept itself should not be. Now, where do we see this idea of intersectionality in practice again? Well, here are 2 more photos from the Women's March, 2017. This sign here on the left is a great example of intersectionality. It says, "Don't forget, white women voted for Trump." On the one hand, women of all color can find solidarity in their experience of oppression as women, but not so fast, this woman says. 53% of white women voted for Trump. So even at an expressly anti-Trump rally that was organized specifically to protest his election, intersectionality shows up. Race and gender interact in complicated ways, so that shared gender is not necessarily enough of a basis to find solidarity with other women. Right? If only white women are part of this feminist agenda, it's really just white supremacy. So the final sign on the right there. Okay. I hope I've convinced you that critical theory helps to explain many confusing phenomena. If we understand it, we can understand a lot of what's happening in academia, in our culture, and in our politics. Let's turn next to the positive aspects of critical theory. What are its strengths? And this is the ideology, again, that's the heart of the social justice movement. One great strength of critical theory is its focus on systems rather than on individuals. This focus provides a number of important insights. First, the idea that systemic racism or systemic sexism can exist is anathema to many conservatives and to some segments of our hyper-individualistic culture. But a moment's reflection shows that this dismissal is incorrect. Take chattel slavery, or the Holocaust, or Jim Crow laws, or apartheid in South Africa. Clearly, these institutions, these horrors, can't be reduced to individual acts of immorality. The Nazi concentration camp guard might have had no personal hard feelings towards the Jews that he executed. He was just going with the flow, not making waves, doing what everyone else was doing, right? Now, he's personally responsible for not standing up and saying, no, I will not do it. But he's been conditioned by the culture around him. The law was enshrining and codifying wickedness. And it was shaping his moral intuition. And laws do that. So law tells us what to hold as valuable. It tells us what's good and right, and we simply follow it, almost often blindly. So it is true that systemic issues can be problematic, and we should look at them. Second, the concept of privilege is an important one in critical theory. It can be defined as the unearned advantages that the dominant group has over a subordinate group, all things being equal. That phrase is important. For example, we can define white privilege as the unearned advantages that whites have over people of color, all other things being equal. Defined in this way, white privilege can be measured. For example, here's a study by a pager, the Diva Pager, from a few years back, where she examined interviews. They matched up blacks and whites in interviews, sent them off to interview for menial jobs. They found that a white person was called back roughly twice as often as a black person. They were matched. They had same resumes, same mannerisms, same height, same attractiveness. I kid you not, they matched them up that way. And yet the whites received callbacks and job offers at twice the rate of blacks. In fact, they found that whites who said they had a criminal record received more callbacks than blacks with no criminal record. Okay, that is an unearned advantage. The whites didn't do anything to deserve this, right? And it's unfair. Another example, the NBER, a conservative think tank, created resumes for people, and the resumes were the same. They just changed the name on the resume. So if you had a resume with a white-sounding name like Emily or Greg, the callback rate was 10%. If they had the resume the same and changed only the name to a black-sounding name like Keisha or Jamal, the callback rate was 6.7%. Another unearned advantage. It's reasonable to point out that these effects exist and they're harmful. They're not fair. If you're black and you're looking for a job, it's not fair if you get turned down because of your race. And again, you can measure it. There are tons of studies like this one. So white privilege can make a lot of conservatives nervous, but I think it's important to recognize that it can be a valuable way to describe injustice. Warning. I've been careful to define these terms precisely. People don't often do that. There are indeed ways to define and conceptualize white privilege or systemic racism in ways that I think are incorrect. I'm only trying to show that there is nothing necessarily problematic with these terms, but make sure that when you have these discussions that you're defining the terms carefully. Second, critical theorists insist that oppression is bad, and they're entirely correct. Christians especially should agree with this claim because the Bible is emphatic in its condemnation of oppression in both the Old and the New Testaments. The Bible goes so far as to say that Jesus himself was a man of sorrows who was oppressed and afflicted. God identifies with the suffering and commands his followers to seek justice on their behalf. Now keep in mind that the Bible and the dictionary define oppression very differently than critical theorists do. Nonetheless, when those in authority are using their power to crush and abuse the powerless, Christians should absolutely be defending the rights of the powerless. Third, critical theory recognizes what could be called the noetic effects of power. That is, how power can influence and corrupt our interpretation of the evidence. So power has a tendency to make us blind to how we're corrupted by power. So critical theorists are right to warn us that our motives and our hidden desires and our motivations will change the way we think and present material selectively, so that none of our arguments are truly perfectly objective and neutral. That's true. We're human beings. We're all biased in one way or another. So that's good to point out. Similarly, hegemonic power does actually exist, and it can have an insidious effect on our norms and our values. The way various groups are portrayed in media, in movies, and television, in books, and in advertising will subtly influence our thinking. So we should be careful to interrogate our attitudes and criticize them and say, are these the unreflective product of what I've been absorbing in the media? Are they just popular stereotypes? Are they true? Are they accurate? We should think about those questions. And finally, critical theorists often desire to give a voice to the voiceless, to speak up on behalf of victims. That idea is a good one. We should care about the vulnerable. We should help those who can't help themselves. So these are all strengths of critical theory and of the social justice movement. But having discussed some of the ways in which critical theory offers valuable insights, let me look next at its weaknesses. Number one, not everything can be reduced to power. Critical theory views all of reality through the singular lens of power. As a result, you'll find critical theorists making comments like this. Marriage is a class relation in which women's labor benefits men without comparable remuneration. It means payback. This is a picture of my wife. She's a doctor. I quit my job as a theoretical chemist at Duke to homeschool our 4 kids. So what's going on in our case? Who is oppressing whom? Is she oppressing me? Am I oppressing her? Should I start billing her for my time and my kids' education? That would go over well. No. That is not the right way to understand a marriage. A marriage is based on love and commitment and mutual sacrifice, not on power. Here's another incredible example. Numerous critical theorists identify adultism as a form of oppression. Here's a quote. Most of us were oppressed as children through the impact of adultism. That's the hegemonic use of power to control what kids think. Children experience 10 to 15 years of unpaid labor and brainwashing in our current form of education. Here's a picture of the 4 little human beings I'm currently oppressing and exploiting for their unpaid labor. Side note, I wish. It would be nice if they could clean up their toys once a week. So I'm not getting a lot of value out of their unpaid labor, frankly. But again, that's not the right way to think about families. It's just families and marriages and these relationships are not best seen through the lens of power. They're meant to be loving. People in authority ought to use their power to serve those under their authority, to care for them, protect them. That's the right way to view these relationships, not through power. Okay, but that's the only sort of tool that critical theorist has. Everything when you only have a hammer, everything's a nail, right? Okay. Third, here's another way in which treating everything as power is dangerous. Truth claims cannot be reduced to power. People influenced by critical theory will not necessarily ask questions like, is this claim true or false? What evidence is there to support this claim? They won't ask those questions. Instead, they'll ask other questions like this. Is this claim hurtful to the oppressed? Does this argument legitimize the claims of people with power? So this tendency to ask different questions derives from the premise that oppressors disguise bids for power beneath the guise of objectivity and facts and science. So rather than focusing on the truth claim itself, is it true or false, they dismiss the claim because it's perceived to be motivated by a lust for power. But truth is not reducible to power. Evil, oppressive people can make true claims, and good oppressed people can make false claims. In fact, powerful people with lots of power can make true claims which legitimize their own power. If Bill Gates says, hey, I founded Microsoft, that claim is true, whether or not it legitimizes his wealth and status. And if a very oppressed person says the earth is flat, they are just wrong. It does not matter whether they're oppressed. Reducing all truth claims to bids for power is a bad idea. Second, power is context-dependent and person-dependent. Take white privilege. Does a particular white person have certain unearned advantages over a particular person or non-white person, all things being equal? Well, I've shown you data in the U.S. Yes, that's true in some cases. But is that true if we put that same white person in North Korea or in Iran? No. In the same way, we need to recognize that privilege can exist in some settings, but not in others. An identity that is privileged in one context can be a liability elsewhere. Or what about the individual nature of power? Here are 3 white men. It's Gordon Gekko from the 80s movie Wall Street, this powerful investment banker. Here's Pajama Boy from one of Obama's campaign commercials. And here's almost politically correct redneck from the Meme Hall of Fame. Now, looking at these 3 men, they're all part of a group that wields hegemonic power. Which of them actually wields power, you think? The guy in his pajamas drinking cocoa? The guy with the straw in his teeth? Or Gordon Gekko? Yeah, I'm going to guess Gordon Gekko, right? So is it really reasonable to call all of these people as equal participants in the white male oppressor category. No, that's not reasonable. They're very different. They're individuals. Third, lived experience is not always a reliable guide to objective, generalizable truth. So here's how lived experience is supposed to work according to critical theory. Someone says, as a woman, I've experienced personally sexism. Now then, from that personal subjective experience, we're supposed to infer the second statement. Oh, well, sexism is objectively rampant in our culture. Now, if you say, wait a minute, how does that follow? You say, are you denying her experience? Are you invalidating her identity by saying you don't believe that second claim? She's told you her truth. And then the third step is, well, we should dismantle the patriarchy. Now, what's wrong with this sequence? Well, it's completely logically invalid. We'd never reason this way with respect to any other issue. Watch this, watch. Let's change the claim in question and see what happens. As a woman, I have never personally experienced sexism. Therefore, step 2, sexism does not exist in our culture. Step 3, therefore we should reject the idea of the patriarchy. Here's another one. As a mother, I have personally experienced the damage that vaccines did to my child. Therefore, vaccines are objectively dangerous to children. Therefore, we should stop using vaccines. One more. As a cult leader, I have personally experienced the voice of God talking to me. Therefore, God is objectively talking to me. And therefore, you should come to my compound and prepare for Armageddon. Now, all of these examples suffer from the same flaws. We start with a personal experience. That's fine. If someone makes a claim and we have no reason to doubt them, then we should accept their testimony in general, right? However, personal experiences are subjective. They have to be interpreted, and that interpretation might not be correct. And also, they have to be generalized or extrapolated many times to get to some objective, general truth. That might be, we have to question that interpretation and the extrapolation. Moreover, we can't draw conclusions from one general truth claim without analyzing it carefully. What are the pros and cons? What are arguments for and against? What are the other pieces of evidence? So you can't just leap from personal experience to some solution that's invalid logically. Finally, critical theory is self-refuting because it turns a blind eye to the power dynamics that critical theory itself creates and perpetuates. This is a still shot from a video, it's on YouTube, of Professor Brett Weinstein, who's a professor at Evergreen State. There was an email sent out to all of the white students and faculty saying, this year we want all of you to stay home. You are not allowed on campus, or you're suggested to not come to campus today to show your solidarity with students of color. Professor Weinstein thought about this and said, you know what? That's a bad idea. Excluding people from coming to class because of their race is actually discrimination. We should not do this. In response, some students came to his classroom and yelled at him and called him outside and started protesting his statement. They actually ended up taking over the campus and shutting it down. He was told that his wife's safety was in danger. Police would not intervene. Was told they could not help him, and eventually he had to resign. So the question here is, who had the power in this situation? How is it being used? The people, for espousing critical theory, ran him off of campus with threats of violence. That's power. Number 2. Here's an email sent to Jane Mathias, a student at Ryerson University in Canada. She attempted to write a paper on the gender wage gap between men and women. Her professor sent back this email, insisting that she is not permitted to use business sources. Why? Because they blame women. She was also forbidden, this is great, she was forbidden from using government statistics because they reproduce mainstream stereotypes, assumptions, and misconceptions. Instead, she should look at feminist sources on this issue. Now, I could list a lot of other examples here, but they all would serve to show how critical theory is very influential in certain environments. So critical theory itself has become a hegemonic discourse that excludes all other viewpoints. Now, wait a minute, aren't we supposed to dismantle and overturn hegemonic discourses? So if critical theory is used to justify silencing white or male or conservative or evangelical voices, then hasn't critical theory become a means of oppression on its own terms? And then isn't it our duty to liberate people from the oppression that critical theory itself produces by deconstructing it or by silencing those who practice it? So critical theory devours itself. It saws off the very branch it's sitting on. It wields its principles selectively, because as soon as we apply it universally, it undermines its own authority. Right? It has become a hegemonic discourse, and therefore we ought to, on its own reasoning, dismantle it. Okay. Finally. This is really finally. At the very end of the talk, I want to talk about Christianity in particular. So we talked about sort of general secular objections to critical theory. For Christians now, how should Christians think about critical theory? I want to propose what I think is the most problematic part of critical theory by looking at a parable, a story that Jesus told in Luke chapter 18. It's the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. So let me just tell the parable, explain it, and point out how it connects with critical theory. So here's Jesus talking. He's saying this. To some who were confident of their own righteousness, and he looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. Who were the Pharisees? They were very devout, religious Jews who strictly observed the Jewish law. They were well respected by the people. They were known for their piety, their morality. In contrast, the tax collectors were despised. They were seen as animals. They were seen as grossly immoral. At the time, the Roman Empire was ruling Palestine and brutally oppressing the populace, often killing them by the thousands. Tax collectors were Jews who, get this, collaborated with the Romans to extort taxes from their own people. You can see why they were so despised. They were traitors. So here's the story, continued. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, robbers or evildoers or adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get. So no surprise, the Pharisee is pious, he's praying, he keeps God's laws. He doesn't rob or steal, he doesn't commit adultery, he fasts, he doesn't eat, he gives to charity 10% of his income, he gives away to the temple, to the poor, and he thanks God that he's not like, guess who, this despised, immoral Roman collaborator, the tax collector. Now what about the tax collector? What does this guy pray? He's in the temple too. What does he say? Jesus goes on. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Here comes the shock. Here's the conclusion that Jesus gives us. I tell you that this man, the tax collector, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. The tax collector went home justified before God, declared righteous, innocent, absolved, forgiven, healed, rescued, restored. This oppressor, this collaborator, a man who had helped a brutal, imperialist, foreign power subjugate, pillage, and kill his own people, is declared right with God. That is offensive. Yes, that is the gospel. From a Christian perspective, the biggest problem with critical theory is that it undermines the message of the gospel by strictly dividing people into the good people and the bad people. That's not the way it works. There are not good people and bad people. There are bad people who think they don't need a savior, and bad people who know that they do need a savior. We are all bad people. I'm not trying to minimize the actual suffering and oppression you might face. I'm not doing it. But I'm trying to show you that it's not your main problem. No matter how oppressed you are still in need of forgiveness. You have broken God's law. You haven't loved your neighbor as yourself. You haven't done things God asked you to do. You haven't loved him with all your heart. You've broken his laws. It doesn't matter how socially conscious you are. It doesn't matter how many rallies you've attended. It doesn't matter who you vote for or how hard you work to liberate the oppressed. You stand condemned before God. And it doesn't matter how religious you are. It doesn't matter how much you go to church and read the Bible. It doesn't matter that you're a fine, upstanding, debt-free, tax-paying citizen. In your natural state, you are also justly condemned before a good and loving God. We are all, in our natural state, corrupt and dead, and we need to be raised to life. And that's the good news of the gospel, that Jesus did not come to give us a great role model. He did, but primarily he came to be our substitute. He came to rescue bad people. As Tim Keller says, a pastor in Manhattan, he says, Jesus lived the life we should have lived, a life of justice, of goodness, of charity, of mercy. He lived that life in our place that we should have lived. He died the death that we deserve to die as unjust, greedy, selfish, wicked people. He died that death, and then God raised him from the dead, defeating death once and for all. And when we say, I am that guy, I am the tax collector, when we admit our sin and our need for him, then God wipes out our sin and credits to us his righteousness. He says, you are my beloved son, like Jesus was. And then he transforms our lives. He changes our hearts. Because then we go out into the world filled with a new love for God and for other people, and then we can seek justice. So the main problem with critical theory from this perspective is it thinks there are some good, justice-filled people who are seeking the right things and some wicked oppressors, when the reality is we all are in desperate need. So if you're not a Christian tonight, and take nothing else away from this talk, please hear this. Christianity does not teach that God sends the bad, evil people to hell and takes the nice, good people to heaven. Christianity teaches that we're all bad people. But in spite of our badness, God sent Jesus to die in our place, to take away our punishment so that we can be forgiven and have new lives with new hearts to be transformed. But it's an unearned gift. You can't bargain with God. You can't trade him your good works for Jesus' death, right? Just accept it as a gift. So then what should we conclude overall here? First, there's no one accepted definition of social justice. So when you discuss this issue with your friends, ask for clear and precise definitions. Second, a large segment of the social justice movement is rooted in the ideology of critical theory. Recognizing that fact helps us to understand what binds together all these different causes under a single umbrella heading called social justice. Third, critical theory is a worldview. It is a comprehensive narrative, a story, a way to see all of reality. It has many good points, which we should acknowledge, but it's trying to address real issues, real injustices, and inequalities that Christians should care about. However, it also has a number of problems, and in particular, it undermines the basic message of the gospel. Christianity insists that our fundamental problem is sin and that Jesus is the only solution. In contrast, critical theory insists that our fundamental problem is oppression and the solution is liberation through activism. Consequently, while Christians can use critical theory carefully as a tool, they cannot and must not embrace it as a worldview. So I am done. If you're curious about other areas of potential conflicts between Christianity and critical theory, and want to learn more about how Christians should think about social justice, you can come back next week, talk about those topics. But otherwise, I'll be happy to take your questions. So, thank you.